Zach, it's amazing. He told people to come hear him speak, and then we got flooded with registrations in the last 36 hours, almost overwhelmed our system. So, very well known, prominent, and I've had the pleasure to meet Zach. He messed with us at Fort George just over a year ago. So, fascinating individual, and we're really pleased to offer him here today and bring him to this series. So, Zach, we're going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for such a lovely introduction. That was incredibly kind of you. Thank you very, very much. So today I'm going to be talking about the components of a gentleman's wardrobe through research, pictorial research, written research, as well as a few original pieces that I have to sort of show to you today. But I thought I'd start off with a little reading from La Belle Assemblée from the Fashions of November 1806. Morning dress is a plain, single-breasted frock of brown or olive with metal buttons. The waistcoat of striped toilinette, any colour, is rather long than formerly. Pantaloons, drabs of all degrees, in general worn with hussar boots. The hat is somewhat broader in the brim, and the hair, though less affecting the antique, is still much dressed out before. Now, to give this context, we have to then understand what on earth is being spoken about. So firstly, they're mentioning previous fashions. So this is 1806. To give that context, it's the year after the Battle of Trafalgar, to help give you an idea of where that fits in the historical timeline. The whole period around 1805 and 1806 moving onwards, the men's style of fashion is changing, which is quite well shown from these two images, where one gentleman has his hair slightly longer and powdered, and the other one looks more sporting and about town. This is the idea and the change that is happening in men's fashion at this point, going from one design to another. Now, when we look at Regency dress and what we expect of Regency dress, most people often think of Mr. Darcy. Now, Mr. Darcy, whilst being a good archetype to hold up, he's perhaps a little bit too small c conservative than would have actually been assumed by a gentleman of his class and status, as well as when Jane Austen was writing Pride and Prejudice originally, she was writing it in 1797. So Mr. Darcy would have looked somewhat different, probably with powdered hair and wearing silk, as opposed to the trolling around in a lake type variety. So discussing the layers of a gentleman's wardrobe, if given the perfect situation, I'd be doing this in front of an audience, and it'd be a quite different situation. And it wouldn't be quite as warm because I'm getting a bit of a greenhouse effect thing here. So firstly, we look at the shirts. Now, a lot of these shirts, when they have come up for auction or when people find them in places, they tend to be misdescribed as night shirts or night dresses and things like that, because they are so very much longer to the modern shirt that we're generally used to. Shirts of the period from the 14th century all the way up until pretty much the mid-19th century, their whole construction, the way they're put together, doesn't really change as much. The main differences tend to be the amount of fullness in the sleeves, the height of collar, cuffs, and whether a ruff, for example, is added. These garments, because they are a form of underwear, are all constructed from squares and triangles to basically save on cloth when you're going from selvage to selvage in its construction. Now, about this time in 1806 and 1805, you find the styles of collar changing once again. We are moving from the smaller band of the 18th century to a more sculpted form of shirt collar, which you see adapting with a few varying types, where at the back of the collar, rather than it being one straight piece, you are now beginning to find that you have them with gauze inserted to help the front pieces of the collar stick up more. There's also another version where the two pieces are cut as a sort of trapezoid, where the geometrics are part of the way in which it will fold around your neck and then go up. This is the real beginning we have of geometry and the use of mathematics being really ingrained in the whole principles of tailoring. Up until this point, there's much more of a drafted nature and block type nature to the world of tailoring. There are, however, of course, measures and things that you have throughout the 18th century, but there aren't these sort of systems which become heavily relied upon during this period. So that's always something quite interesting. And this whole movement of mathematics towards the construction of clothing, as well as a whole holistic ideal in society, moves. It's sometimes referred to, well, I've seen it referred to as the Second Enlightenment, where there was the Great Enlightenment of the earlier 18th century with the better understanding of sciences, and then there's the second one where they're going, oh, let's actually apply that to our everyday lives. So this is where people are beginning to wear pocket watches more, and they're investing in scientific ideas. This is where we get the first real boom of the Industrial Revolution. So this enables us to have machines like the Jacquard machine, which is weaving cloth and textiles to geometric and floral patterns. It is, in effect, the first computer. And when I was discussing this with a modern tailor, it was that light bulb moment where there are modern tailors who can input measurements into a computer, and it creates a pattern for you. That's how heavily relied upon to the side of mathematics we've come from drafting something on the body and going with measurements from the 18th century, launching ourselves through the view of a scientific study towards the full mathematics of garment construction. And humbly, that all sort of begins with the notion of proportion and construction of the shirt. So when people think of history, they look at achievements and things like that, as opposed to sort of going, well, actually, the whole social zeitgeist is built down to even the smallest level, because everything mattered to someone. As we now have people that are obsessed about one particular piece of clothing that they might have in their wardrobe, or that is an upcoming trend, who had the exact same thing in the 18th and 19th centuries. So now we've looked at shirts a little bit. I have yet to have an original. I have seen loads of originals. I've got to handle a few originals, as well as I have an upcoming project where I'll be recreating an 18th century shirt using historical techniques from antique linen, which was found in a loft in France from, well, it's hard to necessarily exactly date, but we're guessing that it's from about 1800 to 1820. So that's another vital thing about construction, is the materials in which we're using. So, sorry, moving on to stockings. Now, all of these stockings you see here, brightly colored, striped, and polka dotted and such, were not out of the realm for men. There are written accounts of members of parliament attending session with embroidered stockings and stockings of purple hues and things like that. And one person described it as a fashion show from the knee down, or a fashion spectacle from the knee down. as with everything, they go through trends. And you look at things now, and when everyone's suits, modern day business suits, are a bit more reserved, you tend to find that there are some people now with funky socks. So some things never die. So here I have a pair of early 19th century stockings, which someone sold as Victorian. And I was like, they're not Victorian, they're earlier. But once again, the construction doesn't really change. But as you can see, here you can see the shape of the leg. Now, this pair was pretty much bought and put away. And the way we know that is because the maker's tags are still in there, which are little red little marks, which would have originally connected the pairs together, which have since been lost over time. But this is a way in which the stockings would have been marketed together. And what's also quite fun is that they were made for someone, because we have their initials BC on the top, which would have worked as a laundry marker, as well as if you had a house of a few gentlemen, or even because at this point, men and women's stockings are becoming indistinguishable, apart from sometimes foot size, that you have these sorts of things cropping up. Another feature which shows them off is the clocking. Now, the clocking is the stitching going from the gore of the foot, where it all attaches, because these are all seamed, knitted in pieces, and then it goes up there. Now, this first started as a simple way of reinforcing a seam and reinforcing stitches, as right here is a weak point where the angle of it all changes, as well as where the ankle bone is. So it just makes sense to put, it started off with a few essential stitches, which then, as with everything, necessity turned to artistry, and it became a fancy thing, to the point where you have lavishly embroidered silk stockings that are embroidered in gold and silver. And I've looked at a pair of Napoleon's coronation stockings that he wore when he was, so Napoleon crowned himself, and then he went around Europe repeating it every few years as he conquered somewhere else. So he crowned himself King of Italy for a bit, and then gave it over to Marat. But they were the stockings that he wore for his coronation in Italy. And they are of the most amazing pure white silk, but then with really heavy bullion embroidery right up the clocking up to the side, with a crown and a cipher. So no part of a gentleman's wardrobe was overlooked. Every single part was part of telling a story and giving an impression of who you were, which is quite fun to think that you sort of go to that level. And this is also an example of the early use of a rotary knitting machine, because also you can see at the back where there is a hole. Now, this hole you would have run a piece of tape through, linen tape, or even a worsted tape, to help tie off the top to secure it, because of course this is before elastic. Naturally, a knit will have some give to it, but this allows it to stay up. As you can see from Hogarth prints and illustrations, the sign of a drunken man is someone with sort of loose stockings, because they've slipped from underneath his breeches because he's seen as undone. And there is the characteristic seam up the back, which is almost sort of obsolete at this point, because this is being rotary knitted, so this seam isn't necessary. But what it is it's cheating itself to look like a more expensive pair of stockings. So you'd wear these, seam up the back, because a seamed up the back pair of stockings would have been frame knit, where you have it on a frame and sewn a sort of one interesting leg design, as opposed to sewn in the round, which these clearly were. And what's amazing is that these stockings are still in such good condition after all this time. And stocking materials come from all types. You have stockings which are made from wool, silk, linen, basically any fiber that can possibly be turned into a yarn was used. The Georgians, as in the people of the long 18th century into the Regency, were nothing if not fastidiously practical. Now, in terms of legwear, it's rather exciting because I very, very, very recently came into the possession of a pair of breeches. So here we have the archetypal legwear of the period. You have pantaloons, breeches, and such. Now, from my pictorial and written research has led me down the route that pantaloons were worn with hussar boots, but breeches weren't worn with hussar boots. It's all about the notion of the slimming leg and the fact that you didn't want to be showing off your knee band. But rather excitingly, the other day I bought on eBay of all places. So I am going to do a more extensive video showing this, but I bought a pair of Victorian riding trousers, which were not Victorian. Neither were they riding trousers. They are a pair of 18th century silk breeches in pristine condition. It seems as if they were made and put away and comfortably left away from the sands of time, which often destroy these things. So someone could missell it on eBay. And now I can look at it a bit better. Because I can't have it on my lap, I have them laid out. But 1 second. So what's rather exciting, breeches. Now, these are fascinating in a variety of different ways. These aren't symmetrical. Now, if you had asked a tailor or a bootmaker or really anyone in the 18th and early 19th century, basically the era before mass production machine work, to make something where both sides were identical, they would have probably laughed at you a little bit because that's the nature of handmade. But when I say that these pair of breeches aren't symmetrical, I mean that they were cut instead of, as we assume most things are cut on the fold and cut out. These were cut one leg at a time, and the piecing then done on each piece before then being constructed. So I've done some investigatory dating with people. When I say investigatory dating, I don't mean I've gone out and started dating curators. I mean, I've been talking with curators about dating breeches. You know, maybe that's a dating website for people, you know, dating breeches. So we discussed what these could be. So these breeches appear to straddle the point between the 18th and 19th centuries in terms of construction and cut. So these are fairly high-waisted. Breeches go from almost hugging the hips and being kept on by the hip bone in the 18th century, all the way up to the le bon temps of the 1790s and the hussar uniforms, where one fantastic curator friend of mine discussed a French pair that they had in their collection, referring to them as nipple grazers. They are quite literally that high. Fashion is, well, as Oscar Wilde said, fashion is such a ghastly thing, we have to change it every 6 months. So what's fascinating about these breeches is that they have the high waist you'd expect, but all of the cut, construction, and visual types of the 18th century. So it helps us give a date to more around sort of 1785, something like that. But breeches very similar to these would have still been worn by gentlemen actually all the way up through the Victorian period, especially for courtwear, judiciary, and even just older members that grew up wearing breeches and just didn't want to stop wearing breeches. So these are fascinating, but they are silk satin. They have 5 pockets, which is interesting. There's one big pocket on each side, and then on this side we have a little seam side pocket, which is thin and small and actually fits my glasses in quite well. So it seems to perhaps be for a gentleman's etui, cigar box type situation. It's a long, thin pocket. Or another thought is that it could house something like this, which is a miser's purse. Now, this is one from the 1820s, and miser's purses were called such, well, we get the term miserly from it. And it's all connected with the fact that you couldn't open the whole thing at once. So you were holding onto your money, therefore being a miser. So this one is basically hand crochet knitted with little cut steel accents on. And these were made to be a bit more decorative, but you see them in period etchings as well as descriptions with gentlemen and ladies, but of course gentlemen wearing breeches, having them just popping out the side. And it's just another bit of dangly ephemera to have around your nether regions, which appears to be the sort of go-to look for most men in the 18th and early 19th century, because you'd have this, you'd then have your fobs, and you'd just be, with walking about, there'd be a lot of movement going on, which I find quite interesting when we have these modern preconceptions of the past being prudish, when in fact they're doing as much as possible to draw as much attention as possible to that area of the body without necessarily being rude about it. So it's sort of flirting with your accessories. So that's the sort of thing I'd expect to perhaps go in this pocket. It just excites me because this is so pristine. It is quite literally as if it was made yesterday, apart from the fact it's all hand sewn and there's like a few moth holes on pieces of the wool. So the facings that would get the most wear have been rather cleverly faced in wool, and the leather lining continues into its own pocket. So all the pockets are lined in leather, which was actually very common during the 18th century, but begins to lose favour in the 19th century in favour of harder woven linens and such. There are other archetypal pieces from the period in the fact that on here you have the other pocket, also known as a frog pocket, flaps down as well, but has 2 pockets inside this pocket, both of which are comfortably large, about the size of my hand, both of them. So on each side, on both hips, you have 2 sets of pockets. And what originally perturbed me was that what you generally expect to see would be a line for a fob pocket. However, the fob pocket is in the waistband itself, which further highlights the fact that these breeches are more likely earlier than later, because in terms of the possibility of actually being able to access your watch or not. If you were wearing the fashions of the Regency, where the trousers are meant to go much higher than the waistcoats, the gap of overlay is larger, it's harder to access a watch that is tucked away at the top of the waistband than one that's just tucked at the very seam of the waistband. We're about half an hour in. So I have admittedly altered my talk simply because of, oh my goodness, an original garment, which is in such stunning condition. I'm going to do a much longer video piece that I'm going to put out about discussing these, looking at the techniques and looking under, magnifying glass, and discussing more about them. But this is the sort of thing that you just don't really expect to see outside of a prestigious museum collection. So for it to just randomly pop up on eBay with someone thinking they were Victorian riding trousers was a delight. And they're wonderful. But there are archetypal pieces that keep breeches like this in use and in production, as in the black silk pair of breeches is almost the jeans of their day. So you have the mix between the buckskin breeches, kerseymere breeches, and black silk breeches. That's the chinos, the jeans, and the whitewash pair of jeans. They all exist in this formula. Once again, men throughout history have always wanted a little bit of formula to what they're wearing. There is that whole thing of men will wear things until they fall apart, to the point where there's anecdotal evidence of George III wearing the same snuff brown wool coat over and over and over again, to the point where it's falling apart, got holes in, and it's being referred to that it's just tatty. But he's going, no, it's my favorite coat. I'm not going to get rid of it. So that also gives us a very interesting look into someone's personality, because after all, unless you're wearing something as a uniform for a job or a place in military or judiciary, you would be, it would be a look into who you are as a person and what you're trying to project to the world, and in form of self-expression as well. It wouldn't have been out of the ordinary for, at the same time that these were made, for a gentleman to be wearing a bright red pair of silk breeches, and both would have been as acceptable as the other, unless perhaps you're in the clergy. Although the Catholic clergy, that would have been a bonus point, but in British clergy, not so much a thing. So because I probably banged on about that one a wee bit, are there any sort of questions people have at this point? Because I thought, rather than waiting till the end and getting flooded, I thought it's easier to get the ones that are more on topic.
That's great. Thanks, Zach. And actually, I was worried you were going to put the breeches away before we got a chance to ask. Somebody was asking about the buttons. What are the buttons on that pair?
Yes, thank you. So what highlighted me to the breeches when I looked at the phone photographs were that the buttons, to me, from the photograph, they look like weird metal buttons. It took me looking under strong sunlight like this. You probably won't be able to see it so well, but on this one especially, you can just see it. It's dark, and then there's 2 layers of brown popping through. These are pressed horn, which is amazing. And I'll also be talking about something else about pressed horn as well. So this is basically horn, ivory, and all of that. They're all made of keratin. Same thing as your fingernails, same thing as your hair. And when heated up and boiled, see, this is how ivory sculptures are made. This is how the great Zeus in the Acropolis was covered in ivory. People were going, but ivory is a stiff circular thing. What do they do? Cut it into loads of strips? No, what you do is you split it. So as you would with a piece of horn, you'd split it, boil it so it completely softens. In that boiled state, then you can mold it into something like a button. So you have the metal shank at the back and then you mix it sort of with a glue, most likely a rabbit skin glue to help sort of put the shank in there. But then you press the whole thing together, it cools, and you have your first, this process is the first notion we have of how we can potentially make plastic. So it's that first notion of the understanding of molding a sort of a pliable solid. Because up until this point, you have to think that people, generally speaking, with buttons, you're either going for metal or covered. Now, for the more showy buttons down the bottom, which wouldn't have been receiving the same wear and tear the buttons at the top would have had, these are a silk covered button. Now, my initial thought when I first unpacked them was, are these all replacement buttons? Now, you do find replacement buttons on breeches, and in fact, lots of historical garments that have had a long life, buttons get replaced, especially the ones that are being used a lot and have a lot of wear and tear. For example, you have the waist buttons and everything. However, these buttons are, all of the buttons are taped, which means that they are an integral, that their application to the garment is an intrinsic part of the garment's construction. So there is a linen tape that runs underneath and is poked through all of the buttons whilst the garment is being constructed, and then the lining is put in. So it also means that these are original. It helps sort of give credence to when these buttons were about. And on a smaller scale, you can see it with the braces buttons at the back, where they are poked through, tape is put through, and then just sewn over. But what I really love about these taped buttons in the back particularly is that the stitching to apply it is just done in the same black silk as everything else. They haven't tried to match or hide the stitches. And then when you look on the other side, you can see some of those stitches just sort of poking through against the silk in a way which we would find very messy. But for them, it's just practical. And this is another thing I try to get across to people about actually how practical people of the past were. You know, people tend to think of those in the past being backward, when in fact they were a lot more far forward than we necessarily think. So yes, that's buttons for you.
Thank you. There were several questions about buttons, and I think you've covered them all. But more for the people in our chat. If I've missed something, feel free to post again. But I will try to come back to more questions in a few minutes. And then Zach, maybe a quick one before you move on. Do you have funky stockings? Do you like to wear kind of outrageous stockings? Do you have a favorite pair?
I do have lots of fun stockings. So unfortunately, having these things made isn't so much of an easy step now. But what you can do, and I experimented with a bit, is if you get sort of stretched jersey material, it works really well to make stockings with. And so I've seen photos of, I haven't examined the book, but it's basically a book of knit material samples, which could be used for all sorts of things. Knit materials, you could have stockings with them. You could also have things like, you know, knitted caps and such made from pieces of material which were knitted, or things like skin tight breeches and pantaloons, which were knitted and as skin tight as possible. You have hussars doing that sometimes, where they are having knitted pantaloons to basically show off all their assets. There's no way of talking around that. It's just what they did. And this is another thing about talking about society, that this whole thing of everything being skin tight, you know, people go, oh, it's so elegant. It's like that they're doing this for a reason. It's the equivalent of the sort of topless gym selfie thing now, wearing, you know, knitted pantaloons. So I've experimented with making a few fun and exciting ones, and it's something I would like to get into more. I do have a really wonderful supplier of stockings, Sally Pointer, who also has a YouTube on here. So after all this today and everything, you can go and have a look at her channel, because she does the most amazing things. She works with techniques and things all the way from prehistory, talking about prehistoric dyes, which you just don't think about them wanting. You think it's all about survival. It's like, yeah, but why not survive and be fancy at the same time? Is pretty much, as humans, we've always wanted something, some color, some mark of our identity. And that comes across in all the layers of society and, in fact, clothing. So she's where I get a lot of my stockings from. I have made some, although you can't really make them historically accurately. I mean, myself, I can't, because I cannot knit. But the main place that used to make stockings throughout the 18th and 19th century, up in Macclesfield, I believe, was basically the home of frame knitters. You have this thing in the same way as you do globally now with industry. You had pockets of industry all over the country which were specialists in specific things. So you had Birmingham, which was the height of silver, cut steel, and what was referred to as the toy industry. Now, toys, we think of a little thing for kids. Toys historically means small metal pieces of doodad, basically. And because they were all produced there, they just became known as toys because they were small metal doodads. And that's a change of thing. But I hope that answers the question on stockings by then talking about Birmingham.
I'm going to let you continue and just point out to everybody in the chat, we will come back to some more questions later if I didn't get to yours. But thank you for those, Zach.
That's all right. One thing I found in my collection, about a year ago or so, I bought a job lot of buckles at an auction. And these curious things came along with them. And I had no idea what they were. These are vital. This is just fun. I love it. I had no idea what they were. They came as a pair, and they have, it's quite hard to see because it's very worn down, but there's an 18th century design of sort of a rose and a bow, which is a very typical 18th century type design, but they're worn smooth. So I was like, okay, this thing has to be under constant wear in order for the design to quite literally be polished off. They are silver, they are English, but the hallmark as well is rubbed away. So you think, what on earth are these? I found out that these have two uses. Because at the back, there's sort of like a arrow type design. These were put into buttonholes, and the edge is actually quite sharp. These were put into buttonholes on a pair of stocking garters. So instead of having to tie your garters in the same way as you might have a military neck stock with graduated things on, you have it in a much more dainty form for stockings. And because of the sharp pieces, you could actually attach them directly to a pair of stockings. Say you put them sort of 2 inches apart, and then you can then bring it together, folding in the rest of the extra cloth. And that's something I love. And it was from the School of Historical Dress posted about a thing they were doing about talking about stockings and garters and things. And they put up a photo of an original pair of garters. And for the first time, I finally had an answer to what on earth these things were. And that's just a fun little tidbit. And the fact that no matter how much we think we might know or how much we feel we might have researched a subject, we are perpetually surprised by sort of what's going on and what we end up finding. And that's another sort of little happy moment between the fact that these stockings could fit something like these on. And I just love that that hidden bit of silver was still lavishly decorated. So it shows that every layer is of use. So we've covered the sort of waist down pretty much, apart from shoes, but I'll come to shoes later on. Now, you've got your gentleman dressed in a way. He's got his shirt, his braces, his breeches, stockings, leggings, or whatever, and so all of that done. So now it comes to arguably one of the most important pieces of the Regency man's attire that would have been the focal point and is crazed about all over social media whenever a interesting portrait comes up, is the cravat. So the cravat comes from its humble beginnings in the early 18th century, being a long band of hemmed fabric, normally of a ultra-fine linen. And this sort of gossamer muslin linen was so fine and so thin, it was actually referred to as spun air during the time, and it was so highly prized. And if some of you have been following the news, India are now going back into production of original muslin. Muslin was so highly prized since ancient times. It was traded, like triple its weight in gold to the ancient pharaohs. So the pharaohs would have been wearing the same muslin from the same place that then thousands of years later would have donned the necks of the Regency gentlemen. It's that fact that things are so close, but yet so far as time goes. So cravats become a hot topic during the Regency. It becomes the ultimate stable of how well dressed you are, how well connected you are, what clubs you're into, what political parties are you supporting. So it became the sort of political t-shirt, but round the neck as well. There are apparently over 87 ways to tie a cravat. And I'm slowly working my way through trying to master some of them. And different cravats have different meanings, different usages as well. So generally the cravat of the Regency period is a yard square. So it's a great big square of material measuring 36, 36, 36, 36. But you have all sorts of permutations on that. That is the most extreme generally that they get. There is, however, a larger one which was called Cravate de l'Indienne, which was often favoured by Murat because it had the printed and embroidered borders that would have been popular on Indian saris, but on a neckcloth. And you wore them sort of, because they were so long, because they had to accommodate this border, they would have been wrapped up and they would have gone round the back of the neck, around the front of the neck, and gone round and created sort of a barrel on the neck before them being crossed over at the front is one way of doing it, and then pinned to the braces or even just to the shirt. So it's out the way, but it actually provides you with a lot of support when riding a horse. And this is why in modern horse riding, you still wear a stock like that, a tight piece around your neck to help you, quite literally, it's almost a neck brace in situ before you have an accident. So what you would have done with your square of fabric, I tend to have mine about sort of 30 inches square because I have a very small neck. There's no point going for such a large piece otherwise. So 13 square, you then halve it into a triangle. Now this is where it becomes a thing. You then fold it down on itself until you are created with a tube. Then this tube, this whole thing would have been heavily starched every step of the way to turn that spun air material into something with the stiffness of paper. And you would have tied it in so many different ways of tying it. Right now, what I've got is a barrel knot. And it means that the front is nice and stiff. I mean, I haven't bothered starching this one. But there was an idea of it had to be perfectly stiff and straight. And to also achieve this, they had neck stiffeners, which could have been made of whalebone. And when I refer to whalebone, I of course mean baleen, taken from the sperm whales. Baleen are the sort of the filtry teeth at the front, which are incredibly flexible and were used in stays and corsets for pretty much all of history. And so they were actually very flexible. And I'd like to get hold of, because sometimes you can find boxes of antique baleen, because of course now we're not up for whale hunting. It's not a good move. So that's why technology changed. You can use a synthetic whalebone as well. But just for research purposes, it'd be interesting to work out, because after all, baleen being, once again, keratin, a natural fiber, it molds and warms and softens due to body heat. So right against the neck, it would have kept its shape and form to give a solid, flat bit, because the front of our necks, as men especially, we have the Adam's apple, and it creates an unsightly sort of bulge in the way of your perfectly done cravat. So you would have put this over the top to help smooth everything out before putting your cravat on, which would have just created this sort of cone column of white spun air, which would have just spilled out the front. Now, a gentleman of leisure, a gentleman who could be in the position to call out another gentleman for a duel, would have several cravats, so there's this anecdote of the valet of Beau Brummel coming down from his dressing room and being asked, "What is that?" And he's holding a platter covered in starched and rumpled cravats, going, "Oh, these are the failures." Now, my theory behind that is that's just showmanship. That's just, let me parade this past you, because after all, you're here to watch him dress. Isn't that amazing? And by, doing this, it's going to get everyone talking. It's just a publicity stunt. You don't need to do that. All you need occasionally is maybe two on hand if you really mess up the first one. And if you don't want to keep doing it, you can just have a hot iron next to you just to sort out the issues, which Beau Brummel with a valet would have been able to do, but having them brought down on a silver platter is far more exciting. So these things were known, these great big cravats were so important. They would have been of the whitest linen as well. So it's that whole thing of showing that, oh, you can afford starch, not just any starch, you can afford rice starch. So that's really a thing. Rice starch also was heavily taxed at this period because, of course, everyone previously would have used them for powdering their hair, but it was so expensive that people thought, I can't afford to put that all on my head for it to be brushed away all the time. So it then became the status of starching out everyone's cravats. So they could still say, oh, you're wearing a starched cravat. I know from across the room that is, you'll be using this amount of fabric, which is going to be X guineas and shillings worth. And then you're using rice starch on top. So it's the equivalent, I suppose now, of wearing several iPhones around your neck and changing that throughout the day. It's just another show of wealth. And that's just before you've got onto coloured and patterned ones. For example, there were ones with the tricolor on them, and there were Irish ones to do with Irish independence, done in green silk and then embroidered. There were ones worn throughout. At every point in history where there's any form of conflict or you want to send a message, people didn't write it down so much because a lot of the population couldn't read. You did everything through what you showed, and showing on your neck that you were wearing the bright blue of that particular political candidate signaled to everyone you knew that that's what that gentleman's doing. This then, interestingly, turns into a moniker for the underground LGBT community. So how would one gay man find another, and how would one lady find another type thing? Oh, we've all bought our cravats from that particular shop who only sells those particular cravats to people that specifically ask for them. This continued throughout the Victorian period, and then it became the handkerchief culture, which is something still used in the BDSM community. So it's interesting to think that something that was the pillar of industry then being subverted for politics, sexual identity, then into something completely different today. So that's quite interesting. So we've gone from neckwear. Now here comes, in fact, now might be a good time to pause so I can actually get them out of the box, because I have some waistcoats to show you.
So Zach, I've got a number of questions. I'm not going to tie you up too much, pun intended, but I have a number of questions on cravats, and I'm just going to suggest that several of us on this call have asked you previously to make a dedicated video on tying cravats. So I am going to remind you of that. And then another question, not in any way related, but perhaps at the end, we're wondering if you could bring those breeches back. Specifically, a lot of questions around the knee band and that sort of thing. So maybe we could cover that at the end.
The mysterious knee band. You know, the amount of issues I had for years about knee bands on breeches until I looked at an original pair. I was like, this doesn't make sense. And then once you look at an original, you go, oh, that makes perfect sense. So that's quite interesting. But I'm just going to grab. Waistcoats. I suppose the modern equivalent of the 18th to 19th century waistcoat would be your fancy jacket lining. Rather than during this period, it's a case of you can wear whatever you want. So this just gives you an example of waistcoats commonly worn during the period, the sort of styles and archetypes and designs. Now, this orange one is a import from India. And it was woven, as in woven to that exact design, which is fascinating. And it's emulating at this point, as well as the other dotted ones, are attempting to emulate the fashion of leopard print, because there was nothing more fashionable than wearing bright orange leopard print. In Ackerman's Almanac, you have fabric samples along with fashion plates. And for the spring of 1809, you have bright orange polka dot leopard print velvet being seen as incredibly popular for men's waistcoats. But it's not something you ever see Mr. Darcy wearing. So there's always that interesting dichotomy between what history shows us and then what history was actually like and what people perceive. Now, one thing that I think, you know, unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure everyone's heard of Bridgerton. Now, there's a lot to unpack about the dress in that series, mainly around the fact they tried to make, they went with the express look of trying to make the Regency seem more exciting and sexual and all of this, when in fact the real Regency was far more exuberant than they tried to imagine it was. So they went down this route of saying, we're not going to do your standard Pride and Prejudice period drama. We're going to make it look fantastic. And it's like, yeah, but it was really fantastic. And if you look at original sources and original garments, you go, oh, wow, Bridgerton played it down. You know, they thought they were being expressive and exuberant. In fact, they were just playing it safe. And the thing that I suppose, great series and all of that, but the thing that annoys me about the costuming in it is not the fact that they chose to take a route with it and imagine it and create this other world, which I think is fantastic. But what's lost on it is the fact that the general public and even myself included to many points. Some clocks. That without understanding what history actually looked like, you then can't appreciate the artistic decisions made to alter something. So if people don't know what history looked like, they can't see the amazing design choices. They just go, oh, it's all fantasy. It's like, well, no, because this is what the fashion was, and this is how they adapted it. And I think there's almost a trick being missed in terms of, I feel that if people had a better understanding of what things were actually like, they'd then have a better appreciation of the techniques and designs used to alter these things. But on that being said, in terms of anything that could be embroidered was embroidered. So to give you an example, this is a book of embroidery samples, as in the artistic representation, which would have been given to an embroiderer to embroider a waistcoat. Now, these date all the way from the sort of 1780s up into the Regency period. And they completely blow out of the water that concept of the stage gentleman look and the reserved look when you come across something like this. These are embroidered psychedelic mushrooms for a waistcoat. I'm just going to show them to you again because it's mental. It's just crazy. A design to go on a man's waistcoat. And, you know, here's another fun example of a fun example of monkeys being embroidered onto a waistcoat. These are all designs which were used and embroidered and worn by people. And this one covered in insects. There's one in a collection which is quite literally embroidered with fish, and another one embroidered with chickens. So really, when there are also some, you know, because I suppose boys will be boys historically, there were some very explicit waistcoats, you know, under the guise of it being classical literature. It's like, oh, what's that swan doing with that woman? It's like, oh, it's about Zeus. So none of it's very PG. But it's that whole thing of, it was another way of someone expressing themselves and just being crazy. So on that respect, there is this. This is actually, for the period, fairly simple, because this is an embroidered, see, my theory with this sort of thing is that there are a lot of them at the period. This one isn't, but where you had embroidered ribbons, because this is a separate piece, embroidered ribbons being added to a decorative or plain fabric to give the impression of being overall embroidered. So this is embroidered in a sort of, actually a very geometric type design filled with pink, purple, yellow, white, brown, orange, and greens in a sort of geometric design, which is just fantastic. And also it's double-breasted, a thin double breast, probably from around the same time as the breeches, around sort of 1785. Now, the techniques for this waistcoat in particular is the fact that these are running stitches, which overall in terms of construction, this is not a terribly difficult waistcoat to recreate, which I will eventually do at some point, because all you have to do really is embroider that whole segment, which can quite easily be done by a machine, and then just running stitch some decorative threads. But as you can see, huge great big pockets. Now, what might a gentleman keep in his pockets? I'm so glad you asked. Now, I was talking earlier about pressed horn. This is a pressed horn snuff box. Now, this snuff box in particular is, you know, it's sort of love and loss with all the hearts and the cherubs, but it's also, so it's French Revolutionary. Well, the ideals of the French Revolution, because you have the whole idea of fortitude and longevity and all these things. And these are sort of pillars of virtue which were put forward by the French Revolution as an alternative to Christianity, because they were thinking, if we're going to destroy everything, we might as well quite literally destroy everything. And they tried doing that. So this is pressed horn as well. Now, this is pressed horn, which you would have then mixed with ox blood and sawdust to create a very hard version, very similar to the buttons. And it gives this sort of brown type design. So it looks like it's almost like a carved wood piece, but actually it's very solid and very, very tough. And it is in fact horn, and you can sort of see it better from the inside. But on some of them, they're milled so thin, you can actually sort of see the striations of the horn itself. So this is a snuff box, a large snuff box, but perfect to fit in a large waistcoat pocket. Because of course, men were not carrying their pocket watches in waistcoat pockets. Waistcoat pocket watches are worn in the fob pocket of the waistband. So then it opens up the question of what did they have in there? And then a more sort of English version is, of course, this early 19th century agate type design, which were incredibly popular. And when people do their grand tours or even just visit Scotland and the Lake District and all of this, they'd come back with little souvenirs like this. Once again, a nice small little trinket to go in a waistcoat pocket. Another interesting thing, which you see come up a lot in fashion plates, and this is another thing about science being adopted and used to drive necessity, is one of these. This is a waistcoat monocular. It's basically, you know, it's a tiny telescope which you would have in your waistcoat pocket. It was a way for a gentleman of leisure to go, oh, look at that over there, but also to signal to everyone that, look, I'm up with the sciences. I know what I'm doing. You know, I have interests besides gambling and whoring. I'm actually really deep, you know. So it's almost a hipster type design in terms of, you know, oh yeah, I'm so clever. Like I have a telescope in my pocket. I'm so learned. So unfortunately, along its life, the back of the waistcoat has gone and has been replaced by, you know, just some cotton twill. But apart from that, it's quite accurate in terms of shape and construction. But there is really no end to the embroidery you can have on a waistcoat or the material in which waistcoats can be made. There are waistcoats being made during this period of pineapple silk, which is the fibers of the leaves of the pineapple plant, which are then basically, they go through processes and then can be woven into a silk type material. There are dresses from the period made of it. And what's interesting is this technique is now being rediscovered as a ethical and more environmentally friendly alternative to the use of cotton. So it's interesting how fashion and consciousness sort of becomes full circle. Now, what's also quite lovely about this waistcoat is it has matching death head buttons. So death head is the terminology given to the wrapped silk buttons like this. So they've chosen silk threads which match the embroidery. And in fact, could potentially be the same threads that they would have used for the stitching on here. Now, what's a bit unfortunate, but also quite fortunate for me, is the fact that this one is falling apart. So you can actually see the button mold itself, which is bone. Button molds of the period could be made of bone, ivory, cardboard, leather. I've seen a few versions of metal ones, but metal ones, the metal blanks were designed to be heavy, designed to then be covered in silk and then put at the bottom of tailcoats to add weight and to keep that line going. It's also referred to at the time that Beau Brummell had curtain weights put in the back of his tailcoat. Now, people think, where did he stitch those? No, he just replaced all the buttons on the back with metal weights to help create that tailored line. So really, there is no be-all and end-all when it comes to waistcoats and their design. What's also interesting about this one is, like the one I'm wearing now, it is a shawl collar design. It is not the stand-up collar that you expect, which also means that the profile of the back is also quite low, which also helps us date it. But what's wonderful is that you can then see how the whole back is constructed. And what's great is actually, I hadn't thought of that with the sunlight, but you can see the piecing through the light, which is actually fascinating and something I hadn't noticed. But I do find it incredibly enjoyable. And at the back, where we have unfortunately sort of lost the back piece, you can see under the embroidery to see sort of how it was constructed as well. So that gives us a look into waistcoats and how they're worn and why they were worn. And really, any fabric you can think of was used in the making of a waistcoat. Waistcoats would have been worn in all seasons. There are waistcoats which you would have, so you could have double waistcoats, or waistcoats which you could either wear two waistcoats or a false slip waistcoat, so it gave the effect of wearing two waistcoats. This can be a fashion thing, but also a thermal thing. They're all about layering and getting those layers involved. As well as, along with the doubling up of waistcoats, you can then have waistcoats which are quilted, which falls out of favour in the Regency period, but is more prevalent in the 18th century, because of course, when you think of the construction and the style of coats in the 18th century, they don't tend to close all the way down. There's very much a hook and eye or button situation here, and then the rest of your torso is left open and exposed to the elements, which is why there was that layering that went on. Interestingly,
sorry, I'm going to intervene. We're past the targeted time. I don't know if you can move on to coats, and then
yes,
because there's a lot of questions in the queue too for us to have time to get to them. I think we got about 15 minutes left, and then we have to stop. So.
Sorry, that would be me getting into original garments a bit too much. Okay, so tailcoats. These are the sort of go-to thing of the Regency period, generally in a dark blue. However, it is described that coats of the period were not just dark blue. Dark blue tends to be the most favoured, in the same way as the archetypes of today, we have the sort of jean jacket or something like that. But what is actually incredibly popular during the period are snuff-coloured coats and olive green coloured coats, especially for the evening, worn with gilt buttons, with then contrasting or matching velvet collars. Now, once again, there is the whole notion of, coats being worn and what is seen as appropriate. However, once again, any material can be used, but here are some silk versions, which are hardly shy and retiring. These are both So this one is from the 1790s, but that one is from the 1810s. And what's fascinating is that these are bright colours. The gentlemen, you know, as with every garment we look at, gentlemen of the period are not shy and retiring with their dress. It is once again an issue of what you may find appropriate personally, but these tend to be the forms. The style of tailcoat comes first off from the English hunting style of coat, because of course you have the frock coat of the 18th century, which prevails very much through into the Regency period, but is superseded by the tailcoat, because the tailcoat ends up just being a bit more practical. With the higher waistlines and everything, it seems more practical to have a coat that stops at your waistline so that you can then use it for various things, as well as with warfare being, you know, put to the fore with the Napoleonic Wars. You have the whole notion around practicality of where your sword belt is going to go, and the layers end up changing. There's that transition point in the 1790s where they're trying to keep the older style of coat, but the waists are going up and they're trying to put swords where they need to go. And it ended up falling apart, and they went with, no, you know what, we're changing the uniforms entirely, which you tend to see across the whole of Europe at this point, going to the tunic and trousers type design, which ends up staying pretty much as is in terms of composition of pieces throughout the 19th century until today, really, where we still have that as a notion. You look at the battle dress of World War II, and they have the same construction around hussar dress in terms of the fact that they could actually button to one another. So it's almost like a military all-in-one or baby grow type design. You then move on to frock coats, which can be worn either over a tailcoat or just over a waistcoat themselves, as you can see here. Now, there is the notion between what inspires what. Does civilian fashion inspire military fashion, or does military fashion inspire civilian fashion? I'd like to put forward that it is both, because the officer class, the gentleman class, they are the young bon tons of society. Just because you put them in red doesn't mean they're not going to stop trying to be fashionable. And it's also dependent on your colonel. If you have a particularly lenient colonel, or a colonel that, I believe one historian phrased it quite well, something along the lines of, was a great favourite to his younger male officers type situation. So depending on the sort of colonel you had, you either had to stick exactly to regulation, or as long as you have the right amount of lace and buttons, you could do whatever you liked, which enables the whole mass difference between historical uniforms and their regulation. So here we have a civilian